Screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you today about a very entertaining and at times bizarre topic. And thank you very much for that nice introduction. Art forgery is a subject that I have found fascinating. I hope you too will enjoy the world of art fakes, forgeries, and heists. I'm so glad you could join us today on this really rainy occasion. If nothing else, it beats cleaning closets. My husband observed that I'm always saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, here are my 1,000 words. I couldn't resist this cartoon to introduce our talk about art fakes, imposters, and forgeries. So let's begin with this question. What is art forgery? Well, art forgeries are defined as works deliberately made to resemble the style, technique, and manner of a certain painter in order to deceive prospective buyers. So forgeries are intentionally made to trick, to defraud. Forgers have the scientific and artistic tools to create an authentic illusion, which can also include the provenance documents or the history of its ownership. Some of the biggest forgers have even staged photographs with people in modern period dress next to artworks to show convincing documentation of an artwork's history. Now, the forger rarely makes a duplicate, but instead copies the style of the master. So, knowing that, which of these two paintings do you think is the original by Vermeer and which is a forgery in his style? Give you a second to look. Well, the painting on the left is the original Vermeer, and the other is a fake by one of the world's greatest forgers. But it's almost impossible to tell the difference. Forgeries are a large problem in the art world today. What do you think is the percentage of fake art in the art market? As much as half of the art on the international market could be fake. Many works of art have been initially lauded by critics and experts as some of the greatest accomplishments of the masters, and later were condemned by the same experts after they were found to be fakes. This is true of one of these paintings, which is by Goya and which is a fake. Give you another couple seconds. Well, the original painting on the left is by Goya, and the other, City on the Rock, long attributed to Goya, is now thought to have been painted by a 19th century forger. Elements seem to have been copied from the original. Knowing that half of the art on the art market could be fake, how big do you think the art market is today? The art market was estimated at $67.4 billion in 2018. So it is no surprise that art forgery has become a multi-million-dollar enterprise, especially when you consider the value of some of these artists' paintings. A Jackson Pollock painting was recently sold for a refuted $140 million. So, which of these Pollocks do you think is a fake? The one on top is a fake. The other is in the St. Louis Art Museum. You can see how difficult it may be to recognize and unmask a fake. It seems like bigger and stranger art schemes are revealed each year. Some forgers are extraordinarily talented artists in their own right, while some are just plain scoundrels. Whether you consider them to be schemers or geniuses or a little bit of both, their stories are fascinating. What follows are some of the most notable and unusual art forgeries in history. So let's begin with a brief history. Copies versus forgeries. Copying art dates back more than 2,000 years. As long as there has been artwork, there have been copies. Roman sculptors produced thousands of copies of Greek sculptures. They were the first avid art collectors and copiers who loved and admired Greek art. Roman stonecutters made thousands of copies of Greek marble and bronze statues for private gardens, bathhouses, and public buildings when Greek originals became too expensive and too rare. So the Romans copied from the Greeks, and Renaissance artists copied from them both. It's been happening for centuries. And contemporary buyers knew that these works were not genuine. Art was generally created for historical reference, religious inspiration, or simply aesthetic enjoyment. The identity of the artist was of little importance to the buyer. Many of these copies became as valuable as their Greek originals, and today are in museums around the world, valued themselves for their beauty, their craftsmanship, and their history. The piece on the left is Running Artemis. It's a Roman copy of a Greek Hellenistic sculpture and is one of the most prized sculptures in the St. Louis Art Museum. The one on the right is also a copy. It's a Roman marble copy of a Greek bronze. There are very few Greek bronzes around because the bronze was melted down for military use. For centuries, artists have been copying the subjects, techniques, and styles of other artists. These works have been called many things: copies, studies, afters, pastiches, replicas. I love afters. I think that's great. And in the past, copies and originals could be interchanged. Works of art were not thought of as singularities, as unrepeatable. When a great Byzantine icon was copied, the new version was felt to have had the same relationship to its divine subject as the older one. There are actually lots of genuinely old panels with newish religious icon paintings on them in the market today. The fact is that it was not a problem for art forgers to buy an old wooden panel with damaged painting, scrape it off, apply one of the new Russian icon paintings, and simulate its age by distressing the new paint. This was typical for centuries, but today it's a problem. Until the Renaissance, these accomplished artists were respected and rewarded handsomely, but few knew or cared who they were. Today, masterpieces are supposed to be one-of-a-kind objects, but artists, even great ones, have always copied. They did it in order to learn. They did it for pleasure, and they did it for clients who wanted copies of unavailable works. Copying works of the masters was a normal part of any artist's academic training. During the Renaissance, many painters took on apprentices who studied painting techniques by copying the works and style of the master. As a payment for the training, the master would sell these works. It was considered a tribute, not a forgery, although some of these copies have later been attributed to the master. It was not seen as a negative and unoriginal practice, but rather as a great artistic challenge. This was how artists learned and how they paid tribute to great artists. Now, many artists even copied their own work. The original of this painting in the St. Louis Art Museum was painted in the 17th century by Peter Paul Rubens. On the request of the sitter, 2 copies were made, probably one for each of his estates. We all need to have a self-portrait in our houses. No one knows what percent of these copies was done by Rubens or his students, but certainly because it is an incredible painting, Rubens, at the very least, closely supervised his students and assistants. As such, it has made it difficult for experts to determine whether an artwork was made by the master or by his students. One great example of this attribution confusion concerns this wonderful portrait of a young man, thought for many years to have been a masterpiece painted by Rembrandt. There were so many Rembrandts that in 1968, the Rembrandt Research Project, the RRP, was established with an admirable objective to say definitely what was and what was not a Rembrandt. So welcome to the weird world of Rembrandt scholarship. By the first half of the 20th century, Rembrandt was believed to have painted some 600 to 650 works. But from the 1970s onward, that number shrank rapidly to about 250. Today, it's about 350. But that's a small number for an artist like Rembrandt, who lived such a long, productive life. This painting from the St. Louis Art Museum is one of the many to have been reattributed by the RRP to Rembrandt's students in his style, not to Rembrandt. I think they're wrong. I love this painting. It is a subjective and touching study of a young man, an observation of life, not just a likeness, typical of Rembrandt. Perhaps one day it will be reattributed to the master himself, and its value will improve manifold. Oops, uh-oh. Okay, so what happened? How did things change? How do we go from respected copier to unscrupulous forger? Following the Renaissance, the increasing prosperity of the middle class created a fierce demand for art. Guilds of master artists and students became virtual factories for art that was produced to fill this demand. New secondary markets in the form of dealers, galleries, and auction houses developed. For the first time in history, art became a commercial commodity. It became a business. Some criteria for judging the monetary value for all of this art was needed. The most readily available one was the identity of the artist, and soon fraudulent signatures began to flood the market. Legislation was enacted, and the formerly respected tradition of copying art became art forgery. Next to prostitution, forgery is probably mankind's oldest profession. Ever since there's been a market for desired as opposed to necessary objects, there has been a market for copies. But while copying has always accompanied art collecting, with the influx into the art market of gazillionaire American, Mideast, and Chinese art collectors, the market for fine art forgeries has grown immensely. And the repercussions for forgery often reinforce this idea, resulting in more perks than punishments. As we'll see, it's rare for forgers to receive serious jail time, and many emerge from this ordeal with more fame and opportunities than they had to begin with, including an increased price tag for their original work. So let's take a look at some of the biggest scandals and most fascinating art forgers in history. From Vermeer to Pollock. One of the earliest named forgers was, believe it or not, Michelangelo. In 1496, at age 21, Michelangelo made a brand spanking new marble sculpture of Sleeping Cupid and treated it with acidic earth to make it seem ancient. He then sold it to a dealer who sold it to a cardinal, who later learned of the fraud and demanded his money back. However, Michelangelo was permitted to keep his share of the money. He was too good. Rather than hurt him, this propelled him to fame. Being able to forge an ancient Roman statue showed the incredible talent that Michelangelo had, and he went on to become one of the Renaissance greatest artists. And the cardinal became one of Michelangelo's most important patrons in Rome. The legitimate ancient Roman Sleeping Cupid sculpture is on the left. Michelangelo's Cupid is thought to have been destroyed in the 1698 Whitehall Palace fire. And the famous statue of Laocoon is now thought to have been another of Michelangelo's forgeries. This story of the most famous art forger sounds like something from a cheesy World War II movie. Hans van Meegeren sold $60 million worth of fake Vermeers to everyone from Hermann Göring to the government of the Netherlands. He didn't start out as a forger. He simply wanted to be recognized as a legitimate artist. In fact, he wanted the title so badly that he created his own works replicating Vermeer's style and developed a complicated system of baking the work to age it. He allowed them to be sold to unknowing buyers who thought them to be genuine. For a while, he got away with selling the detailed forgeries for astounding prices on the Dutch market. But when one of Van Meegeren's paintings ended up in the collection of the high-ranking Nazi officer Hermann Göring, Van Meegeren was arrested for treason, for being a Nazi collaborator, for being a plunderer of Dutch cultural property, and for refusing to name the original owner. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, Van Meegeren confessed to forging the painting, but the work was so good that he had to prove his guilt by forging another Vermeer painting while on trial. Talk about pressure. Amazingly, for a trickster, opinion polls in 1947 placed him as the second most popular Dutchman behind the then prime minister. His work rose in price after he became famous, and now the forger is being forged. On the left, you can see the piece that he copied, that was his copy, and on the right, you can see the trial with the blank canvas that he was to paint his Vermeer on. Hungarian painter Elmer de Hory's elusive past as a con artist was a mystery until his suicide during an art fraud investigation in 1976, when new discoveries were made about his repertoire of 1,000 forged paintings, including Modigliani, Degas, Picasso, and Matisse. His pieces have become so appreciated over time that today his fake pieces are knowingly on the auction block for a whopping $20,000 at San Francisco's Terrain Gallery, and forged de Hory's appear often on the art market. He is most famed for being in Orson Welles' last film, F is for Fake, which was a fake documentary itself. The movie moved between fact and fiction as it examined people like de Hory's who commit fraud at the expense of others. A French expert on Modigliani believes that there are over 1,000 fake Modigliani paintings in the world today. Robert Dreesen made his riches by selling off Giacometti works as his own. With an estimated jackpot of 8 million euros, he is considered one of the wealthiest forgers in the world. He admits it's easy to copy the Swiss-Italian artist. Long fingers and an amorphous, crumbly surface, it isn't difficult to make Giacometti's, he said. Avoiding the German authorities, he is still in hiding out on a beach somewhere in Thailand. Giacometti, a contemporary of Picasso and Matisse, was the creator of some of the world's most expensive sculptures. A life-size bronze sculpture of the artist sold for a record-breaking $104 million at Sotheby's last year. John Myatt, a British artist, was arrested by Scotland Yard in 1995, and his 200 forgeries of artists such as Van Gogh, Monet, Matisse, Braque, Picasso sold at esteemed auction houses, including Phillips, Sotheby's, and Christie's. Myatt, who was released from jail after a year, has continued to paint and sold his own works for as much as $45,000. He later starred on a TV series, Mastering the Art, on which he shared some of his secrets of copying other people's artwork. George Clooney is rumored to be considering a movie of his life. This is an amazing fact. $5 million worth of art was sold to buyers around the world on eBay. I just can't imagine that. Hundreds of fake works, which were alleged to have been painted by Dali, Miro, Picasso, and Chagall, came complete with replicated certificates of authenticity and fake signatures. They may even have taken in the Smithsonian, which has 6 works in its collection that originated with an American forger named Spouts. Because they were sold through eBay, Spouts was charged with wire fraud and sentenced to 3 years in prison, as well as made to forfeit the $1.4 million he had ripped off. Spouts, who also owned a legitimate art gallery, understood the value of provenance. He forged receipts, bills of sale, letters from dead attorneys, and other documents. The FBI's statement reads, "Some of the letters dated back decades and looked authentic, referencing real people who worked at real galleries or real law firms." Spouts also used vintage typewriter and old paper for his documentation. In 2016, the art world was rocked by perhaps the biggest forgery scandal to hit the art world since Van Meegeren's unmasking. The extent of the old master forgery ring is as yet unknown, But Sotheby's has already issued a refund to a buyer for a $10 million Franz Hals portrait sold in 2011 in a private sale. All the paintings appear to have originated with one man, a French collector turned dealer named Giuliano Ruffini. The works appear to have had next to no provenance, and Ruffini insists he never suggested they were the real deal, and that eager dealers were the ones to declare his paintings Old Master's originals. Other paintings are now implicated, including a Lucas Cranach the Elder from the collection of the Prince of Liechtenstein. Rumor has it that works up to 25 different masters have been forged by Ruffini, all in museums and great collections today. Furniture can be forged too. 4 counterfeit medallion chairs were sold to the Palace of Versailles for $1.9 million. Counted as national treasures, the chairs were thought to be among a group of 12 side chairs created for the palace living room in 1769, where they belonged to Louis XV's last mistress, the Countess du Barry. The problem is that there are now many more than the 12 original chairs from the set floating around. So how did they get caught? Well, here are some really strange stories. An obscure Long Island art dealer named Rosales enlisted a Chinese artist from Queens to paint abstract expressionist paintings in the style of Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Robert Motherwell, and others. The famous Knoedler Gallery, which closed in 2011 as the forgeries came to light, still claim they believe Rosales' story that the works are part of an undocumented collection sold directly by the artists to an anonymous Mr. X. The gallery sold the worthless works for $80 million, leaving a slew of lawsuits. So how did they discover the fakes? Well, the expert report shows the signatures from the 2 Knoedler paintings that were purported to be by Jackson Pollock. The top signature shows signs that the name was first traced onto the canvas using a sharp tool. And the signature on the bottom is misspelled. Actor and avid art collector Steve Martin became embroiled in a massive art scam after it was revealed that a painting that he had purchased for $860,000 in 2004 by German expressionist painter Heinrich Kampendonck was actually a fake, painted by Wolfgang Beltracchi. While the scope of the forgeries is still unknown, it's being called the biggest art scam Germany has ever seen, and the estimation is that there are now 1,000 to 1,300 fakes by Beltracchi. The man himself said he's lost count. Described as the forger of the century, it's estimated that hundreds of his works are still in circulation. Beltracchi's most successful fake was a Max Ernst oil painting. The painting was sold for several $million and even had a stint in the Max Ernst Museum in 2006. Well, what gave it away? Despite using period canvases and frames, Beltracchi was eventually busted for using titanium dioxide white pigment, which didn't exist when Kampendonck was around. 4 months after leaving prison, an exhibition of Beltracchi's work opened in Munich. The story of this forger, Eli Sakai, begins as he worked with his brother at an antiques shop. They started selling fake Tiffany lamps when they realized that if they made good fakes, people would pay tons of money to get their hands on one. Sakai even copied the authenticity labels, knowing that the more real they looked, the more money they could get. After making a small fortune this way, he decided to try something new. So he started buying relatively unknown original paintings by Modigliani, Chagall, Gauguin, and Monet, and hired some very talented Chinese artists to make copies. So what happened? Trouble hit in 2000 when Sakai sold Gauguin's original vase of flowers to the famous auction house Sotheby's. When they started promoting the painting, another auction house, Christie's, announced that they had the same painting in their collection. Both houses called a Gauguin expert who determined that Christie's version was a forgery. The FBI traced Sakai and arrested him, but he was only sentenced to 41 months in prison. This masterpiece of Renaissance jeweler's art was attributed to Benvenuto Cellini and has long been on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York for years. It was actually created by German goldsmith Reinhold Vasters sometime between 1853 and 1890. He was long dead before being discovered as a forger. Well, what gave it away? A scholar in 1979 found more than 1,000 drawings by Vaster that included instructions for assembling this cup. Oops. At least 44 other items at the Met were deemed to be Vaster's fakes as well. Convicted of forgery, oh, here we go. Convicted of forgery in November 2008, Sean Greenhall and his octogenarian parents, I can't believe this, forged works of astounding diversity from 20th century British sculpture to an ancient Egyptian statue. The most expensive and well-circulated forgery the family, known as the Bolton Forgers, ever pulled off was fooling the Bolton Museum into purchasing a fake Egyptian sculpture, the Amarna Princess, for $440,000. Experts believe the sculpture dated back to 1350 BC. A ceramic sculpture called the Faun, created by Paul Gauguin in the 1880s, was perhaps their most successful, Bruce. It was authenticated by experts, sold for millions, and displayed at the Art Institute of Chicago for 10 years. What gave it away? Well, the Greenhalls were caught when a British museum expert noted that the Assyrian sculptural relief tablets they were selling, supposedly created in Mesopotamia in 700 BC, contained misspellings in cuneiform, the ancient writing. The Greenhall family, including Sean's parents and brother, worked together on the forgeries, and the Faun was outed as a fake after the family was busted for selling the so-called Amarna Princess in Assyrian relief. Now, this story is almost unreal. It's surreal. While art forgers have differing motivations and starting points for their lives of crime, an overarching theme is that a forger is a failed artist. Many forgers are driven either by revenge or pride or wanting to prove that they're just as good as the artists they have dubbed masters. The late Thomas Hoving, a director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, wrote that the community of forgers is populated by miscreants who say they fake only to show how stupid, blind, and pompous the art establishment is. Once successful, though, the need for fame and recognition often creeps in. Lothar Malskat worked in the mid-20th century and claimed to have produced 2,000 forgeries. One of his biggest works was a series of medieval frescoes that he and his accomplice claimed to have found while restoring a church in Germany. Once this discovery achieved national attention, Malskat wanted the artistic credit. But when he announced that the frescoes were actually forgeries by his hand, no one believed him. And not finding this response acceptable, he hired a lawyer and sued himself. He proved in court that he had committed fraud by directing viewers to some playful details he had included in the fresco, like turkeys, which didn't exist in that part of the world at the time the frescoes were originally believed to have been painted. Malskat was eventually sentenced to 20 months in prison. With celebrity in hand, his career took off once he was released. His quirky but believable frescoes were eventually washed off. A portrait of Mary Todd Lincoln was supposedly painted as a surprise gift for Abraham Lincoln by a famous painter, Francis Carpenter. It was actually a portrait of another woman, painted by an anonymous 19th century artist, and then altered by a guy named Lou Bloom. Significantly altered, actually. He changed the subject's facial features, painted over some of the accessories, including a necklace and a cross, and added a brooch with the president's picture. Well, what gave it away? The painting was supposedly discovered by Bloom in 1929, but the whole thing was a scam. Bloom was finally outed in 2012 when the painting was sent to a conservator for cleaning and he discovered the underpainting. Fake painting had been used in a few biographies and even hung in the Illinois governor's mansion. So, how can you tell if a work of art is a forgery? Well, it's definitely not as simple as wet paint. Art specialists with expertise in art authentication began to surface in the art world during the late 1850s. At that time, they were usually historians or museum curators. Traditionally, a work in an artist's catalog raisonné had been the key to confirming the authenticity and value. Often, a thorough examination of the piece is enough to determine authenticity. For example, a sculpture may have been created obviously with modern methods and tools. Some forgers may have used artistic methods inconsistent with those of the original artist, such as incorrect characteristic brushstroke, perspective, preferred themes or techniques, or may have used colors that were not available during the artist's lifetime to create the painting. Some forgers may have dipped pieces in chemicals or baked the paintings to age them and made worm marks by drilling holes in objects, making authentication more difficult. But today there are forensic methods of authentication, such as carbon dating, X-ray detection, white lead dating, digital analysis, and many more methods with the advent of newer and more reliable technological tools. Excuse me. In Portrait of a Woman, attributed to Goya, X-ray images taken of this painting revealed another woman. After analysis, the conservators left the work as you see it above, or to the left, with portions of old and new visible to illustrate the intricacies of art forgery and the inherent difficulty of detecting it. So let me pose a question. If you can't tell the difference between a fake and an original, what difference does it make? What's wrong with a fake?
Interesting.
Well, here is one opinion. Some say that if a fake is good enough to fool the experts, then it's good enough to give the rest of us pleasure. Some think of these forgeries as the masterpieces that the artist never got around to making. In some ways, they are by the master, in the sense that they almost perfectly capture the master's unique contribution to art. If they didn't, no one would believe he'd made them. Remember, many wonderful works by Rembrandt, Rubens, and Titian were executed partly or even mostly by their studio assistants. So they say the faker could be considered a faithful assistant of theirs who happened to arrive after the master died. But there is a second opinion. An art lover or even notable art expert can admire a forged piece of art for decades, but as soon as the truth about its origin is discovered, the artwork that was considered a masterpiece just seconds ago, all of a sudden becomes worthless. Today, if the purchasers of great art were buying paintings for their beauty only, they would be content to display fine fakes on their walls. And we know that is not the case. Today, art forgeries, no matter how close to the original, will never be considered anywhere nearly as valuable as the original work of art. Why? It's almost like we humans believe that artists somehow infuse the essence of themselves into their work simply by touching it. By looking at works by Gauguin or Vermeer, we feel connected to them, as if somehow we are looking into their souls. And we pay dearly for that opportunity. Many feel that this is a feeling that forgery, no matter how close to the original, can never evoke. It's all about expectations. Forgers expect to make money and expect that we will not know the difference. We expect access to the aesthetic ideas and ideals of artistic geniuses. I've always wondered why it was legal to copy a master's painting at the Louvre or the Met or at the St. Louis Art Museum. You frequently see artists with their easels and paint set up in front of a painting in these museums, Why would a museum give access to the original piece of art to a copier? One answer is that the artists are not allowed to make the painting in the exact dimensions as the original. So even if the copy is a good one, the size would be wrong and would be recognized as not the original. So how is this for thinking out of the box? In an experiment to slow visitors down, British museums are hanging fake art alongside their masterpieces. Museum goers who report the fakes they spot will be entered in the contest for Britain's top fake art spotter. 10 finalists will be featured in the show's finale, and the winner will take home a commissioned copy of a British masterpiece valued up to 5,000 euros. So let's talk a little bit about forgeries and art heists. We now know that at least half of the art in the art market is considered a fake. But do you know how much art is stolen each year? News articles about art theft seems to appear just about every week. This should not be surprising. It's been estimated that more than 50,000 pieces of artwork are stolen each year around the world, and the black market for stolen art is valued between $6 billion and $8 billion annually. Art forgeries were a major part of some art heists. Replacing the original with a copy is really unusual. But forgeries came into play on August 21st, 1911, when the Mona Lisa vanished. French detectives searched for the painting for more than 2 years in hopes of cracking the high-profile case. Then in December 1913, an Italian house painter contacted a prominent art dealer in Florence, claiming to be in possession of the celebrated portrait. Police swooped in and arrested Vincenzo Peruggia, a former Louvre employee. It turns out that Peruggia had walked unnoticed into the museum, removed the Mona Lisa from its frame, and spirited it out under his clothes. Hailed as a patriot in his native Italy, the burglar served 6 months in jail for the crime. Yves Chardin, the forger, made 6 copies of the painting while its location was still unknown, and sold each of them to American buyers. With each painting worth $330,000, he made off with a pretty penny. In most cases, a stolen work of art is not replaced with a copy. It is just taken and sold on the black market. Do you know what the biggest art heist in history was? The largest theft and art theft of any private property in the world occurred in Boston on March 18, 1990, when 2 thieves disguised as police officers entered the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in the middle of the night, telling guards they were investigating a disturbance. They made off with 13 pieces of art, collectively worth $300 to $500 million. The frames, which originally contained masterpieces by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Degas, and more, are left empty today. You can see them in this photograph. The museum is offering a $10 million reward for information leading to the recovery of the stolen works. It's a good thing the Norwegian painter Edvard Munch created several iterations of his most famous work, The Scream, since 2 of them have fallen into the hands of art thieves in the last 3 decades. First, in February 1994, 4 men broke into the National Art Museum in Oslo and stole its version of the iconic painting, leaving behind a note that read, "Thanks for the poor security." It was recovered 3 months later through a sting operation. In August 2004, 2 masked robbers entered Oslo's Munch Museum, holding tourists and employees at gunpoint as they tore another version of The Scream off the wall. Norwegian police tracked down the paintings, which had both sustained tears and water damage, and apprehended the thieves in 2006. In 2012, Romanian thief Radu Dogaru masterminded a spectacular robbery of Rotterdam's Kunsthalle Museum, effectively plucking works by Picasso, Monet, and Gauguin from the walls in under 90 seconds. The pre-dawn heist was valued at more than 200 million euros. But in a bizarre turn of logic, the deft criminal claimed to be a victim of the museum's relaxed security measures and attempted to sue the museum for making things too easy. I could not imagine that a museum would exhibit such valuable works with so little security, he opined at his court hearing. Oops. Before and during World War II, the Nazis looted an estimated 20% of Europe's rich art heritage, confiscating precious cultural assets either owned by Jews or in museums within occupied cities. Hitler himself, a failed artist, hoped to amass a giant collection for his unrealized Führer Museum. Among countless other treasures, many of which were recovered after the war, some haven't been, German soldiers seized the sculptures and other decorations that adorned the Amber Room, a lavish chamber in the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg. Its fabled contents never resurfaced, and over the years it has been speculated that they were destroyed by bombing, lost in a sunken submarine, hidden in a bunker, or buried in a lagoon. Well, we saw that one. We're going the wrong way, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There we go. Painted by the Flemish artists Hubert and Jan van Eyck, the multi-paneled Ghent altarpiece was created in the 15th century for the Cathedral of St. Bavo in Ghent, Belgium. It has come under numerous threats throughout its tumultuous history, with first the French and later the Germans temporarily seizing parts of it. By the end of World War I, all of the components returned to their original home, but the reunion was brief. One night in 1934, thieves broke into the cathedral and stole the lower left panel, which was never seen again. During World War II, experts painted a replica that remains in place to this day. Its high quality has led some to surmise that it is actually the original hiding in plain sight. Containing elements of danger, glamour, and intrigue, art heists have an understandable mystique. These often multi-million-dollar feats have made for the premises of some highly entertaining movies. I really liked Entrapment. This real-life heist almost feels like a movie plot. Spider-Man, as he was called, was sentenced to 8 years in prison for stealing works by Modigliani, Matisse, and Picasso by scaling the walls of the Museum of Modern Art in Paris in 2010. The art is still missing. And while crimes like the unsolved robbery of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum or the acrobatic antics of Spider-Man gives credence to the visions of cat burglars dancing through laser security systems, art thefts in reality tend to be far more plodding, not nearly as glamorous. The Thomas Crown affair, they are not. In fact, some are just plain bumbling. One of the most spectacular heists from the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam would have been the biggest art heist in history. The Van Goghs were found in a car at a nearby railway station less than an hour after the robbery. As it turns out, a second car with which the robbers had planned a rendezvous had gotten a flat tire. When the car failed to arrive, the spook bandits abandoned the Dutch master's sunflowers, irises, and potato eaters and hit the road. The artwork was estimated at nearly $500 million in value. 4 men, including a guard, were later arrested for the crime. And there was more car trouble. Along with tire jacks, lockpicks, saws, and gloves, thieves may want to consider adding measuring tape to their toolkits. In 2012, a pair of would-be vandals broke into a Stockholm house with plans to steal a trio of paintings, including Claire Obscure by painter Carl Larsson. But the bandits hadn't accounted for the size of their vehicle, and when the 4-by-3-foot work refused to wedge in, the thieves were forced to ditch the painting, nearly running over it as they fled. There is no telling how many fakes still lie in plain sight, accepted as originals by experts and the public alike. Unless all dealers, museums, auction houses, and collectors are willing to pay for scientific analysis, research, and obtaining an expert opinion, there's no way to rid the market of fakes and forgeries. Thomas Hoving estimated that 40% of the objects he examined for the Met were fraudulent, or so hypocritically restored, or so misattributed that it amounted to the same thing. Every museum you go to, they've got fakes, he said, rooms of them. In fact, usually in the basement, but sometimes in the galleries. Reproduction furniture, old Bibles, old master and modern paintings, cloisonné vases from the Han Dynasty. Theodore Rousseau, also an expert from the Metropolitan Museum, said, "We can only talk about the bad forgeries, the ones that have been detected. The good ones are still hanging on museum walls." In case I've piqued your interest in the topic, here is a list of some fascinating books about art history's most scandalous forgeries. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that Judy said she will email these book titles to everyone later so that you can see if you'd like to read one of them. I hope you've enjoyed your journey into the world of art forgery and have enjoyed hearing about the details of a good caper. Perhaps it's helped to pass the time with a bit of humor and some interesting stories. Picasso beautifully said, "Art washes away from the soul the dust of everyday life." Everyday life today is a lot more dustier than usual. I think art can bring a bit of light into these dusty times. Fortunately, art has always been there and always will be. At the St. Louis Art Museum, we're surrounded by the magic and power and inspiration of art, and great art at that. Hopefully, we will be able to enjoy it in person together again soon. Until then, stay safe and healthy, and thank you very much.
That's very good.
I guess we'll
Thank
get
you, Dale.
questions. Oh, thank
If you
you.
have any questions, you
How
can
do
raise
I
your hand or
do
you
I have
can
to-
chat.
stop share, right? There we go. Okay. So anybody?
I'd
have
like to say
questions?
something if I can. That was just the most enjoyable thing that I've ever heard, and thank you so much. But I just wanted to say that the most expensive painting ever sold was Salvador Mundi, which was
Right.
bought last year by the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and it sold for $450 million.
Yeah.
But a lot of experts has doubted if it's authentic, and the painting has disappeared. No one knows where it is. And the other thing I didn't know was that why the Leonardo da Vinci works are so difficult to authenticate is because he didn't sign any of them. I didn't know that until I read that. And is that correct?
I think back in the Renaissance, many of the artists didn't sign their works
Mm-hmm.
during
Okay.
the time. So you're right. I mean, it makes it very difficult to authenticate almost any of the art from that time period.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as you try to authenticate the signatures. Mm-hmm. Pardon?
Dale,
Yeah.
as far as you know, first of all, thank you for a very interesting lecture. As far as you know, has the world of forgeries extended to musical instruments like violins, cellos, and so on?
As far as I know, it has. I mean, you know, Stradivarius can be, you know, in its own. I would think that the world of forgeries is everywhere. Anything that's valuable, somebody's trying to copy.
Have there been any reported cases that you know of?
I don't know. I'm sure we can look it up and find out. But that's a good question. You know, they're always on Antiques Roadshow. But, you know. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Dale. That was great.
Oh, thanks. Anyone else have any questions?
Norman Solomon has a question. Yes, there we go. unmute yourself. Okay, there we go.
If a piece of artwork is stolen, who would buy it?
Oh, gosh. Well, look what happened with you know, I think just any very wealthy person who, I mean, there are many in Saudi Arabia, in the Mideast,
But what would they do with it? They couldn't show it, or everybody would
Oh,
know
right.
that they had a piece of stolen art.
I'm sure they have like a nice little gallery in their palace or wherever. You know, I think it's always, they're sold on the black market, and people, you're right. I mean, they can't resell them because, you know, they can't sell them to a museum or anything like that, but they're in their own galleries, their own collections, basically.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else? Do we have questions? I'm not seeing.
Now, the Annenberg estate, both Annenbergs are deceased in Rancho Mirage, but they have a fabulous tour. But every single painting, and there's just so many of them, are all fake, of course, because they gave all of them to the museums. But you cannot tell the difference. Well, I couldn't, you know, because I'm not any kind of authority. But I think just by the lay person looking at those paintings, they're beautiful. You can't even begin to tell that they're fake.
Well, that would be interesting. I've never seen it.
Yeah, it's beautiful, the grounds and everything.
Well, if we ever get out to California,
Mhm.
it would
That's
be
where
on
you should go. Take a tour. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I want to thank everyone. Dale, it's been such a pleasure to hear about all of this beautiful works of art and forgeries. And I want to thank everyone for being here today. And if no one else has any further questions, I'm not seeing anyone.
Thank you, Madeira. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
You're
much.
all coming.
Yeah, I was just wondering, it just seems like that whatever someone's perceived value of a piece of art, that's what it should be. So, I mean, if it's beautiful to you and it seems like it's worth a certain amount, that it's the perceived value of it.
Right. That is one opinion on how to look at some of these pieces of art. They're wonderful. They're beautiful. They're just as, in many cases, just as good as the original. So that's certainly a valid response. And then there
That
are
was very interesting.
Yeah, there are others that feel no, it has to be exactly by the artist who you know, who painted it, or who was said to have painted it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, again, thank you so much, Dale. And we look forward to another time when we can meet again.
Same here. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.